Julia Child presents the Chicken Sisters, Miss Broiler, Miss Fryer, Miss Roast. In 1958, Julia Child sent a letter to her sister that contained marriage advice so controversial it stayed hidden for decades. She called it her secret to a happy marriage. The advice was so bold that when she whispered it to a famous chef in the 1970s, they were speechless. Her private letters to Paul reveal a woman who was nothing like her polite TV persona. She wrote about passion, temptation, and desires that shocked even her closest friends. The real Julia Child was wild, unfiltered, and completely unashamed. Julia Child was born on August 15, 1912, in Pasadena, California. Her family was wealthy and lived in a big, beautiful craftsman-style house. Her father, John McWilliams Jr., had gone to Princeton and managed large pieces of land. Her mother, Carol Weston, came from a powerful family in Massachusetts and had inherited a fortune from her father, who had once been the lieutenant governor. Julia was the oldest of 3 kids. Her younger brother was named John, and her sister was Dorothy. They all grew up surrounded by comfort, traveled often, and went to private schools. Julia started at Polytechnic in the 4th grade and later went to Westridge. But even with all this luxury, she never learned how to cook because the family had servants who did everything. Instead, she dreamed of writing novels. She graduated from Smith College in 1934, full of imagination but unsure where life would lead her. Even as a child, Julia felt different. By her teenage years, she was already 6'2" tall. Most girls her age were much shorter, so she stood out in every room. She was bullied and called names like giant and freak. When she went to the Katharine Branson School, that made her feel awkward and self-conscious, but it also gave her a special edge in sports. She became really good at tennis, basketball, and golf. Still, the hurt from those early years didn't go away as when she was at Smith College, she used humor in sports to cope. She liked pulling pranks, too. Once she hid an alarm clock inside an organ during a school assembly, and it rang out loudly in front of 500 students. Her mischief made people laugh, but deep inside, she was still carrying the sting from being teased. These experiences later gave her a bold personality, especially when she began appearing on television. Julia's views didn't match her family's. They were strict conservatives who supported the Republican Party, while she started questioning the world around her from a young age. When she was just 10 years old in 1922, she asked her father why the black staff in their home were treated unfairly. He didn't like that question, and it led to arguments. Julia never forgot that moment. As she grew older, she became even more outspoken. During the 1950s, when people were being accused of being communists without proof, Julia strongly defended freedom of speech and civil rights. In 1990, she criticized Republican leaders who said they were pro-life while ignoring the needs of real children who lacked health care. Even in 1985, she warned people about pollution, saying that Earth could end up like Venus, a burning planet, if things didn't change. Her views made her stand out in a family that didn't welcome change. The food Julia grew up eating was plain and tasteless. The housekeepers cooked vegetables until they were mushy and served dry meat with no flavor. She often joked about the boiled carrots and peas she had to eat as a child, calling them dull and mushy horrors in her memoir many years later. She never learned to cook at home, and no one expected her to. But deep down, something was building. One day in 1925, she gagged on some soggy green beans and didn't forget that moment. Later, when she discovered French food in 1948, it felt like a door had opened. She couldn't believe how rich and flavorful meals could be. That moment changed her life. She called powdered soup immoral in a 1970s interview and hated diet food. She didn't care for health trends. She wanted real butter, real taste, and meals that made people feel alive. When her cookbook, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, came out in 1961, it was her way of rebelling against everything boring she had grown up with. Even when she was young, Julia was full of energy and bold ideas. At age 10, in 1922, she and her siblings would climb trees and throw water balloons at people walking by. She once soaked 15 people in a single afternoon. Her family wasn't always amused, especially since they were known for being proper and serious. But Julia loved shaking things up. At Smith College in the early 1930s, she once helped steal all the furniture from a rival dorm just to make a point. She joined the Grass Cops Club, a group that jokingly enforced lawn rules. Her favorite time of year was April Fool's Day. She hid an alarm clock in a chapel organ and let it ring during a quiet assembly. These moments weren't just for fun. They showed how fearless she was. Even if she wasn't the best student, her grades were mostly C's. Her boldness would later help her take big risks in the kitchen and on TV. After college, she tried to make a normal life. In 1934, she moved to New York City and got a job at a fancy furniture store called W&J Sloan. She was a copywriter, making $18 a week writing catalog ads. But Julia didn't like following strict rules. She argued with her boss about wording in an ad and refused to change it. That led to her being fired in 1937 for what they called gross insubordination. It was a harsh blow, especially since she had also worked at their Los Angeles branch. She was only 25 years old and now jobless, but looking back, she saw it as a gift. That job had never felt right, and being let go freed her to explore something new. When she returned to Pasadena in late 1937, she volunteered with the Red Cross. She helped organize reports and responded to disasters like floods. By 1938, she was leading a team of 50 people, helping more than 1,000 flood victims. But her love life was full of heartbreak. One man, Harrison Chandler, was an heir to the LA Times. He rejected her in front of others at a party in 1939, saying she was too tall and loud. Another man proposed in 1940, then disappeared, saying her laugh was too wild. She went through at least 5 serious rejections in those years, writing about them in her diaries. It hurt deeply, and she started to think she might never find love. At the same time, her father was dying, and she took care of him until he passed away in 1941. All of this pain made her stronger and pushed her to take big steps during World War II. Julia had always wanted to be a writer. In the 1930s, she wrote short stories about rich people and scandalous parties in Pasadena. One story from 1936 was 45 pages long. It followed a spoiled girl who got caught up in bootleg liquor deals. Another story, in 1940, was about a tall woman with a broken heart, but she never got published. She sent her stories to magazines like The New Yorker and got more than 20 rejection letters. In 1938, she wrote in a letter that her writing was amateurish and lacked focus. At one point, she got so frustrated that she burned one of her drafts. Still, all that practice taught her how to tell a story, and those skills later helped her become a master at writing cookbooks. When World War II began, Julia wanted to help. In March 1941, she applied to the Women's Army Corps but was rejected for being too tall. She was 6'2", while the limit was 5 feet 10. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, she tried again with the Navy Waves, but they turned her down, too. Instead, she worked harder with the Red Cross in Pasadena, typing reports for intelligence work. Then, in 1942, everything changed. Julia joined the Office of Strategic Services in Washington, D.C. at age 30. She started as a file clerk making $1,800 a year, but quickly moved up. She helped handle top-secret documents and worked on strange projects like shark repellent to keep torpedoes safe in the ocean. This mixture of science, secrecy, and danger was far from anything she'd ever known. She processed over 5,000 files a week and learned how to organize everything down to the smallest detail, a skill she later used when writing recipes. In 1944, Julia was sent to Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka. She worked with OSS agents during a tense time in the war. Every day she helped decode messages and protect Allied plans. That July, she caught malaria and became seriously ill. She was in the hospital for 3 weeks, had fevers as high as 105, and nearly died. But something good happened. Too, she met Paul Child, a kind man who loved food, art, and travel. They began falling in love while the war raged around them. In early 1945, Julia was transferred to Kunming, China. There she worked under constant air raids, helping stop enemy ambushes and saving thousands of lives. Her team uncovered a spy ring that used poison tea. Thanks to her filing system, the spies were caught. She worked with maps, secret codes, and barely enough food. There was a cholera outbreak that killed several people, but she stayed strong. She even found clever ways to store secret information using bamboo boxes. In 1953, long after the war, Julia was investigated by the FBI. They thought she might be a communist because she had gone to liberal rallies and donated to a union in 1944. They questioned her under oath. It was the height of the Cold War, and many OSS workers were also being investigated. Julia answered their questions with calm confidence. She once joked, "I'm no communist, just a gourmet." No evidence was found, but it was a scary time that nearly ruined her career. Back during the war, she had also helped design emergency spy kits. She created lipstick tubes that held tiny cameras and shoes that hid radios. One of her kits even saved a man's life in Burma in 1945. She found ways to use everyday things like baking powder as invisible ink. These spy tools later inspired her love of clever kitchen gadgets. She was always finding new ways to make things easier, whether in a war zone or in the kitchen. In March 1944, Julia McWilliams was stationed in Kandy, Ceylon, Sri Lanka. She worked for the OSS, handling secret messages. That's where she met Paul Child, a serious man designing war rooms. He was 42, she was 31, and honestly, they didn't like each other at all. Paul wrote to his twin brother, saying Julia had messy thinking, a fuzzy mustache, and was way too emotional. Julia wasn't impressed by him either. She found him odd-looking with his light hair and long nose. But something changed. After a trip in May to photograph elephants at the rock temples of Dambulla, Their shared adventures slowly turned dislike into something warmer. All around them, 150 OS workers kept up their secret war work, while these two, against all odds, started falling for each other. By spring of 1945, Julia had been transferred to China. Paul was already there, 400 miles away, in Chongqing, working on maps. When he moved to Kunming, they reunited. He started writing her romantic poems, comparing her to golden leaves and autumn sunlight. Julia, always a little guarded, opened up in her letters. She told him how alive he made her feel. Their talks often stretched into the night, usually with a bottle of gin nearby. She once washed his shirts, and he called her quite a dame. Their letters, more than 200 pages worth, show a romance that was deep, passionate, and sometimes shocking. Julia wasn't just the calm TV cook people would later know. She had fire in her. Then came August 31st, 1946, just one day before their wedding. Their car spun off a wet road in Pennsylvania and flipped 3 times. Julia was badly hurt, bruised, bleeding, and bandaged. But the next day, she walked down the aisle, still smiling. They had packed 8 bottles of whiskey and gin for the trip, a sign of the wild life they were already building together. That crash could have ended everything, but instead, it showed how much they could survive, even before the wedding began. Their honeymoon didn't go well either. Julia tried cooking something fancy, maybe undercooked chicken, maybe calf brains and wine. Whatever it was, it gave them both food poisoning. They spent their first days of marriage vomiting and feverish. Julia later laughed about it, calling it one of her many mistakes. Back then, she didn't know how to cook well, but Paul didn't care. He told her he appreciated the effort. That rough start would one day turn into her greatest strength. In October 1948, Paul got posted to Paris. Julia followed. On November 3rd, she arrived in the city that would change her life. But not everything was magical. She wrote to her friends about frustrations in the bedroom. Paul, who was 10 years older, seemed more interested in books than passion. Julia joked about the 3 F's: feed them, flatter them, and something unprintable as her new rules for marriage. But slowly, food became her way of rediscovering connection. One meal, in Rouen-sur-Moynier, stopped her in her tracks. She had never tasted anything like it. It was simple but perfect. That meal lit the fire. On October 4, 1949, she walked into Le Cordon Bleu in Paris. She was the only woman among 11 American veterans. The instructors mocked her for being tall and clumsy. One made her chop onions until her hands bled. But Julia wouldn't give up. She practiced at home like a maniac, using her marble stairs to sharpen knives. She learned to debone a duck in 2 minutes flat. In 1950, she cut her thumb badly while showing off her technique to Paul, but she kept going. She took her final exam by cooking a full meal in 30 minutes and passed. By 1951, she had gone from a complete beginner to someone her peers admired. But in 1952, Julia teamed up with Simone Beck and Louis Etberth. Together, they started a tiny cooking school in her Paris apartment. They charged $10 per lesson, which is about $110 today. It didn't go smoothly. In 1953, a gas explosion blackened the walls and singed Julia's eyebrows. But she just laughed, called it her baptism by fire, and taught class the next day. Students practiced by cooking 5 pounds of chicken each. Julia, who couldn't have children, threw herself into teaching. By 1954, they had 20 students, and Julia was using black market butter because legal supplies weren't enough. This was no hobby anymore. It was becoming something bigger. Also, in 1952, she started testing recipes for a cookbook. It took over her life. She used 285 pounds of flour, 200 pounds of butter, and 3,000 eggs over 9 years. In 1954, she collapsed from exhaustion, buried under dough and stress. Once she boiled 12 lobsters at once and flooded the kitchen. Paul had to mop the mess while she kept going. She tested some recipes 20 times, including mayonnaise, which she failed 50 times before getting it right. She gained 15 pounds. Paul joked about a butter-induced divorce, but Julia refused to quit. Her goal was perfection, and she wasn't going to cut corners. Throughout the 1950s, publishers kept saying no. One editor told her in 1957 that her book was too French for Americans. Another said she should replace real ingredients with canned food. Julia ignored them all. She kept rewriting 200-300 pages at one point, making things easier to understand without watering them down. She even tested her work on 50 American housewives to prove it worked. In 1958, she traveled to New York with a fever of 102, pitched the book herself, and finally, in 1959, NAPEF said yes. When the book came out in 1961, it sold 100,000 copies in the first year. By 1956, Paul had been transferred to Marseille. Julia kept teaching, writing, and commuting by train nearly 400 miles. She taught 15 classes every month, often using 10 truffles per session. In 1957, she tried artificial insemination, which cost $500, and failed. In 1958, she miscarried. Her letters from this time are full of pain but also strength. She wrote that cooking saved her sanity. Even when a storm destroyed 200 pages of her drafts in 1959, she kept going. Paul typed 500 pages to help her. They were a team, even in the darkest moments. On October 16, 1961, Mastering the Art of French Cooking finally hit the shelves. It had taken 10 long years. The first 5,000 copies sold out almost immediately. One night, on a TV demo in 1961, Julia dropped a potato pancake on the floor and casually scooped it up, saying, "Remember, you're alone in the kitchen." That little moment made people fall in love with her. By 1962, the book had sold over 100,000 copies. But what people didn't see was how hard it had been. Julia had spent $2,000 of her own money just to keep the project alive. Behind the scenes, things weren't always smooth. Julia had worked on the book with Simone Beck and Louisette Berthold since 1952. But by 1959, tempers were flaring. Berthold had only written a few recipes, but wanted equal credit and 18% royalties. Julia, through careful negotiation, lowered that to 10% and avoided a full-on collapse. She had done 80% of the testing herself, rewriting 500 recipes, but the fallout left bruises. Years later, Simone accused Julia of stealing the spotlight. The book's format was revolutionary. Paul, Julia's husband, had drawn more than 1,000 illustrations by hand from 1958 to 1960. One day, on March 15, 1960, a grease fire from duck fat destroyed 200 manuscript pages. It cost them $500 and delayed everything, but they started over. Paul took photos of her hands in action. The format, with its detailed steps and cross-references, changed cookbooks forever. By 1965, it had influenced more than 50 others. Then came the backlash. In 1962, the New York Times praised the book for its clarity. Sales skyrocketed, but some French chefs weren't happy. Henry Saul, a big name, accused her of Americanizing French food. He called it culinary sacrilege. Julia fired back in a 1964 article, saying she was just making good food available to